The stark fluorescent lights of the hospital waiting room seemed to amplify the crushing weight of the paper in Ilara's trembling hands. Each word on the crisp white sheets felt deliberately designed to inflict maximum pain, a stark numerical representation of her terrifying reality. Her eyes, already red-rimmed and swollen from countless sleepless nights, scanned the abysmal sum once more, a dizzying figure that mocked her meager savings. A silent sob caught in her throat, burning as she struggled to hold back the torrent of tears threatening to erupt. Her knuckles, white from clenching the enormous bill, threatened to tear the paper, but she couldn't bring herself to release her grip. The sterile quiet of the late-night corridor was occasionally punctuated by the distant drone of a cleaning machine or the hushed urgency of medical staff, none of whom seemed to notice the young woman whose world was crumbling into dust right before their eyes. Unbeknownst to Ilara, however, she was not entirely alone in her despair. Further down the hallway, partially obscured by a large potted plant, a figure leaned against the wall, gaze fixed intently on her. Liam Sterling, scion of one of the city's wealthiest families, watched her anguish unfold with an unnerving detachment. His posture was casual, one hand tucked into the pocket of his impeccably tailored trousers, the other idly scrolling through something on his phone before letting it drop to his side. His expression remained unreadable, a cool, almost bored assessment of the raw emotion displayed before him. He was a creature of a different world, one where such financial burdens were abstract concepts discussed in boardrooms, not lived, breathtaking realities that crippled lives. His presence was a silent, opulent counterpoint to Ilara's growing desperation, a stark illustration of the vast chasm separating their existences. This was Ilara, a young woman barely into her 20s, whose life was a tapestry woven with threads of quiet determination and unwavering loyalty. Her beauty was not the polished, artificial kind often seen in the glossy magazines Liam's family owned. Rather, it was a natural, understated radiance that shone through the fatigue and worry etched on her delicate features. Her dark hair, usually meticulously pulled back, had escaped its confines, framing a face often touched by a gentle smile, now contorted in silent agony. Ilara was the kind of person who found profound joy in simple things: a perfectly brewed cup of tea, the scent of rain on dry earth, the comfort of her mother's familiar presence. She lived a modest life, nestled within the vibrant chaos of a bustling American city, its towering skyscrapers and flashing lights a constant reminder of a world she observed from the periphery. Her small apartment, though cozy, was a far cry from the sprawling estates Liam inhabited, yet it was home, filled with memories and the comforting scent of her mother's cooking. Her mother, Maria, was her rock, her sole family, her guiding star. For decades, Maria had toiled diligently as the housekeeper for the incredibly affluent Sterling family, the very family whose grandson now watched Ilara's private torment. Maria's hands, though calloused from years of dedicated service, had always been a source of comfort and strength for Ilara. Their bond was unbreakable, forged in shared experiences and unconditional love. The sudden, brutal turn of events had snatched away their sense of security with a cruel swiftness. Just 3 weeks prior, a typical Tuesday evening had shattered into a nightmare. Ilara remembered the sudden, sharp cry from the kitchen, the thud as her mother collapsed, and the frantic, terrifying rush to the emergency room. Maria had suffered a severe medical emergency, an unexpected and aggressive condition that demanded immediate, complex surgery. The doctors had worked miracles, pulling Maria back from the brink, but the cost of that miracle was now staring Ilara in the face: a monstrous figure that seemed to grow with each passing day of hospitalization. The initial shock of the diagnosis had quickly given way to the cold, hard reality of the financial repercussions. Ilara had always been diligent, a saver by nature, but her modest earnings from her part-time job at a local bakery and the small nest egg she had painstakingly built for future education were mere drops in the ocean of debt now facing her. Her mother's health insurance, though seemingly comprehensive on paper, had proved to be a labyrinth of deductibles, co-pays, and out-of-network clauses that left vast portions of the bill uncovered. Each passing day, another bill arrived, adding to the growing stack, each one a fresh assault on her dwindling hope. The hospital's financial office, initially sympathetic, had become increasingly businesslike, their calls polite but firm reminders of the escalating balance. Ilara felt an overwhelming sense of helplessness, a profound despair that burrowed deep into her bones. She couldn't eat, couldn't sleep properly, her mind constantly replaying scenarios, searching for a solution that remained maddeningly elusive. The weight of her mother's life, her recovery, and her future now rested solely on Ilara's young shoulders, a burden that felt almost too heavy to bear. The fluorescent lights flickered above her, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to mock her predicament. She took a shuddering breath, trying to compose herself, but the tears, once held back, now flowed freely, hot tracks down her chilled cheeks. Before we delve deeper into Ilara's struggle against this insurmountable wall of debt and witness the unexpected turns her life is about to take, remember to subscribe to our channel for more stories of resilience, human connection, and extraordinary circumstances. You won't want to miss what happens next. Ilara now found herself caught in a relentless, desperate scramble to accumulate funds. Each morning brought with it a fresh wave of anxiety, a suffocating realization of the impossible task ahead. She diligently picked up every extra shift available at the small downtown cafe where she worked part-time, her feet aching by the end of each exhausting day, her mind reeling from the constant flow of orders and the persistent clatter of dishes. The meager tips barely made a dent in the looming debt, yet she clung to every penny with fierce determination. Her small apartment, once a haven of comfort, slowly transformed into a liquidation center. First went her grandmother's antique locket, a cherished heirloom that brought a lump to her throat as she handed it over to a pawnbroker. Then, the almost new laptop she had saved for tirelessly, essential for her online courses, was sold for a fraction of its value. Next, her most prized possession, a rare first edition of her favorite novel, a gift from her mother on her 18th birthday, was reluctantly listed online. Each sale chipped away not just at her belongings, but at a piece of her soul, a painful reminder of her inability to protect her mother. She spent countless hours poring over financial aid applications, navigating labyrinthine forms and bewildering eligibility criteria. Each rejection letter felt like a physical blow, a door slamming shut in her face. The hospital's financial department, initially sympathetic, grew increasingly insistent. Their calls became more frequent, their tone more pointed, transforming from gentle reminders into veiled threats of collections and the potential impact on her mother's ongoing care. The mountain of medical bills multiplied, each new statement a grim testament to the escalating crisis. The numbers on the page seemed to mock her, astronomical figures that dwarfed her entire life savings and her monthly income combined. Meanwhile, a world away from Ilara's agonizing struggle, Liam Sterling moved through the polished corridors of the same hospital. He was the epitome of inherited wealth, the scion of the Sterling Empire, a young man whose existence was marked by privilege and a certain, almost regal, detachment. Liam often visited his own grandmother, a frail but formidable matriarch who occupied a luxurious private suite on the hospital's upper floor, attended by a retinue of private nurses and specialists. He would occasionally catch glimpses of Ilara, a fleeting shadow of distress in the bustling hospital environment. He'd seen her slumped in a waiting room chair late one evening, her face buried in her hands, and another time, arguing quietly but fiercely with a stern-faced hospital administrator. He would observe her unblinkingly, his expression unreadable, a silent witness to her unfolding despair. He embodied the insulated world from which Ilara was so far removed, a world where medical bills were an abstract concept, easily absorbed by an endless flow of funds. His own concerns revolved around his grandmother's comfort, the quality of her imported tea, or the latest art acquisition for the family's summer estate. He existed in a bubble of almost impenetrable comfort, which sometimes made him appear cold or uncaring, simply because he had never been forced to confront the harsh realities faced by people like Ilara. Ilara, in her desperate attempts at resolution, tried every avenue she could conceive. She scheduled numerous meetings with the hospital's patient advocacy office, presenting her case with a trembling voice but unwavering resolve. She meticulously documented her income, expenses, and the staggering medical costs, pleading for a flexible payment plan, for any form of charitable assistance, or a reduction in the charges. Each conversation, however, ended with the same bureaucratic indifference. "We understand your situation, Ms. Rodriguez, but these are the hospital's standard policies," a robotic voice would often state, devoid of any genuine empathy. "We require a substantial down payment to begin a payment plan, and your application for financial aid did not meet all the necessary criteria." Their inflexibility was a concrete wall against which Ilara repeatedly, futilely threw herself. She reached out to her small circle of friends, most of whom were struggling with their own financial burdens in the expensive city. They offered what little they could: a $20 bill pressed into her hand, a home-cooked meal, an extra shift covered at the cafe. Each gesture, though small in monetary terms, was a profound act of kindness that Ilara cherished, but it was nowhere near enough to bridge the colossal gap of her mother's medical expenses. Her distant relatives, living in other states, expressed their condolences and offered prayers, but their own resources were too limited to provide any substantial financial help. Ilara felt an overwhelming sense of isolation, a heavy cloak of solitude descending upon her as she realized the full weight of her burden rested solely on her own slender shoulders. Every avenue she pursued led to a dead end. Every door she knocked on remained firmly shut, leaving her increasingly adrift in a sea of despair. The hospital's demands grew louder, the stack of bills taller, and the specter of her mother being denied vital ongoing care became a chilling reality that haunted her waking hours and invaded her fitful sleeps. Ilara felt the cold dread creep further into her bones with each passing day, a relentless chill that no amount of frantic work or desperate hope could dispel. The deadlines for payment were no longer distant threats but imminent realities, marked starkly in red on the growing pile of hospital correspondence. She counted the hours until the next, inevitable bill would arrive, a new weapon in the financial war she was clearly losing. Sleep had become a fleeting luxury, punctuated by nightmares of numbers multiplying and her mother's weakening smile. Her once sharp focus at her part-time job, a solace from the swirling anxiety, now splintered easily, her mind constantly replaying scenarios of impending financial ruin. Every conversation with the hospital's billing department felt like a fresh wound, a reminder of her inadequacy. Her mother, sensing Alara's deepening exhaustion despite her daughter's brave facade, would offer weak assurances, her voice raspy from recovery. But Alara knew the truth. While her mother's condition was stable, the path to full recovery was long, requiring continuous medication, physical therapy, and follow-up appointments, each one accompanied by its own escalating cost. The financial burden wasn't just a number on a page, it was a physical weight pressing down on Alara's chest, making each breath a conscious effort. She found herself staring blankly at the hospital walls during quiet moments, the sterile white feeling less like a place of healing and more like a prison built of debt. The scent of antiseptic, once a smell of hope, now triggered a wave of nausea, a tangible representation of her despair. One particularly grueling evening, after another fruitless phone call trying to negotiate a payment plan, Alara felt the fragile dam she had constructed around her emotions finally burst. She stumbled away from the reception desk, the fluorescent lights of the corridor blurring through her unshed tears. Finding a secluded bench tucked away near a rarely used waiting area, she sank onto it, pulling the thick stack of bills from her oversized, worn purse. The crisp paper edges felt like daggers against her fingertips as she stared at the total, an astronomical figure that mocked her meager savings and her tireless efforts. A choked sob escaped her lips, quickly followed by another, then a torrent. She buried her face in her hands, the sound of her own desperate weeping muffled only by the impersonal hum of the hospital's ventilation system. The weight of it all, the sheer insurmountable mountain of debt, the fear for her mother, and the crushing realization of her own powerlessness overwhelmed her completely. Each teardrop felt like a surrender, a painful admission of defeat. Unbeknownst to Alara, a figure rounded the corner of the corridor. Liam Sterling, his mind preoccupied with his grandmother's improving but still delicate health, was on his way to his car, having just spent hours reading to her. He moved with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to navigating expansive, hushed spaces. His expensive shoes made no sound on the polished linoleum. As he approached the waiting area, he paused, a flicker of movement catching his eye. It was Alara, her shoulders shaking violently, a crumpled tissue clutched in her hand. The stark white bills fanned out on the bench beside her. Her raw, unadulterated despair was a visceral, unexpected sight. He had seen her before, a fleeting presence in the hospital corridors, always looking tired but determined. He knew she was the housekeeper's daughter, a fact his own mother had mentioned in passing. But this was different. This was vulnerability laid bare, a pain so profound it transcended their disparate worlds. He watched her for a beat longer than he should have, a fleeting moment of observation that seemed to stir something within him, a ripple in the usually calm, unaffected surface of his existence. He shifted his weight, the subtle movement nearly causing him to speak, but he held back, a lifetime of ingrained aloofness preventing him. He simply watched, a silent, almost invisible witness to her breakdown, then continued on his way. The image of her tear-streaked face seared into his memory. The moment of despair slowly subsided, leaving Alara feeling hollow but strangely resolute. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, the last vestiges of tears tracing cold paths on her flushed cheeks. The bills were still there, the numbers unchanged, but something inside her had hardened. She had to find a way. The thought, cold and unyielding, crystallized in her mind. She had reached the end of conventional solutions. Every avenue she had explored had led to a dead end, every appeal met with bureaucratic jargon. The only remaining possibility, a path she had vehemently resisted, now presented itself with an insidious logic. High-interest loans. The very phrase sent a shiver down her spine, conjuring images of endless debt spirals and exploitative lenders. She knew the risks, understood the predatory nature of such arrangements, how they preyed on desperation and turned short-term relief into long-term servitude. Yet, what other choice remained? To watch her mother languish, to let the hospital transfer her to a less equipped facility, or worse, cease her treatment. The thought was unbearable. The moral dilemma gnawed at her, a bitter taste in her mouth. Taking out such a loan would be a pact with the devil, she knew. It would mean sacrificing her own future, potentially trapping her mother and herself in debt for years, perhaps decades. But the alternative, inaction, felt like a betrayal of everything she held dear. Her mother's life, her mother's comfort, her mother's very existence stood on one side of the scale, and her financial prudence, her long-term stability, on the other. The choice, agonizing as it was, began to crystallize itself with a terrifying clarity. She would dive into that abyss if it meant keeping her mother safe. The sheer desperation of the situation had pushed her to the brink, forcing her to consider options she would have once deemed unthinkable. The hospital's relentless pressure had created a desperate calculus where short-term survival outweighed long-term consequences. This was not a choice made lightly, but a surrender to necessity, a testament to the brutal realities of her situation. She would save her mother, no matter the personal cost, no matter the depth of the financial hole she might dig for herself. The decision, though terrifying, brought a strange, cold calm, a grim determination to face whatever ruin lay ahead. Liam's journey through the sterile corridors of the hospital that evening felt different, heavier somehow. The image of Ilara, crumpled and defeated, clutching those hateful bills, had etched itself onto his mind, refusing to dissolve into the usual background noise of his privileged existence. He had witnessed countless displays of distress in his life. Corporate crises, family squabbles over inheritances, superficial anxieties over trivial matters. But Ilara's raw, unvarnished despair was fundamentally different. It wasn't about losing money or status. It was about losing everything, about the profound terror of a daughter facing the potential loss of her mother. This was a struggle he had never known, a vulnerability so stark it bypassed his usual detachment, pricking at a sensibility he rarely acknowledged. He found himself, over the next few days, subtly altering his routine. Instead of merely checking in on his grandmother and retreating to the comfort of his penthouse, he lingered a little longer, his eyes unconsciously scanning for a familiar figure. He saw Ilara, always moving, always doing something, arranging flowers in her mother's room, speaking softly to nurses, or poring over documents in the waiting area. He observed her tireless efforts, the quiet dignity with which she carried her immense burden. There was no theatricality in her suffering, no demand for attention, just a quiet, unwavering devotion that resonated in a way he hadn't anticipated. He saw the faint purple smudges under her eyes, the way she would sometimes run a hand through her hair in a gesture of weary frustration, only to straighten her shoulders moments later, a renewed resolve flickering in her gaze. He witnessed her interactions with other patients, a gentle word here, a shared smile there, even amidst her own profound struggles. It was a stark contrast to the often self-absorbed world he inhabited, a world where suffering was typically hidden behind closed doors or delegated to paid professionals. This close observation began to chip away at the carefully constructed walls of his indifference, revealing a quiet strength, and an inherent goodness that deeply impressed him. A faint sense of unease, then a growing conviction, settled within him. He couldn't simply walk away. His family's vast resources, their intricate network of influence, suddenly seemed less like a burden and more like a tool. He began, subtly at first, to make inquiries. Using his access within the hospital's administrative system, a privilege afforded to him as the grandson of a prominent donor, he delved into the specifics of Ilara's mother's case. He avoided direct contact with Ilara, understanding that she would likely reject overt charity, perhaps even finding it insulting given her fierce independence. His initial efforts were small, almost imperceptible. He learned of a lingering bill for a specialized dressing, an unexpected charge for a particular medication that had somehow slipped through the insurance cracks. With a few discreet calls to the hospital's supply management and pharmacy departments, his requests framed as general review of outstanding accounts or optimization of expenditure for low-income patients, he arranged for these smaller, more immediate medical supply bills to be quietly covered. He ensured no paper trail led back to him, leveraging his family's vast network without revealing his involvement directly to Ilara. Ilara, amidst her daily battle, noticed a slight easing of pressure. A persistent charge for a specific painkiller mysteriously vanished from her mother's statement. A nagging bill for a new type of wound dressing, which she had been dreading, never materialized after an initial alert. She attributed these small reliefs to various possibilities. A clerical error, perhaps a forgotten charitable fund she hadn't known about, or even the hospital's belated realization of her financial distress. Hope, a fragile butterfly, fluttered briefly within her, quickly overshadowed by the overwhelming magnitude of the remaining debt. She couldn't afford to get her hopes up for minor victories when the war was still raging. She thanked the nurses and billing staff profusely for their supposed help, unaware that the quiet hand of the billionaire's son was gently, anonymously, at work. Liam, observing her from a distance, saw the flicker of relief, even if it was transient and misattributed. It was a small victory, but it fueled a nascent, unfamiliar warmth within him. The act of giving, even anonymously, created a resonance, a quiet satisfaction that far surpassed the fleeting pleasures of his usual indulgences. He had always been told that his family's wealth came with responsibility, but it had often felt abstract, a duty without a direct human connection. Now, seeing the tangible impact of his actions, however minor, on one struggling individual, he felt a stirring of purpose. This quiet, almost stealthy benevolence, however, was not enough. He saw the mountain of debt still looming over Ilara, the heavy shadow that even his small gestures couldn't fully dispel. His privileged upbringing had shielded him from such raw, existential struggles, but Ilara's situation had ignited a sense of empathy he rarely experienced, a moral imperative that slowly began to override his innate aloofness. The image of her breakdown, her silent tears, remained a potent catalyst. He grappled with his internal conflict, the ingrained habits of a lifetime of detachment versus this burgeoning, uncomfortable but compelling sense of responsibility. He had the power, the means, to truly make a difference. The question was no longer if he should act, but how. He decided with a quiet resolve that surprised even himself, to act more decisively, to move beyond these small, anonymous interventions, and confront the problem head-on, albeit still from the shadows. He knew he couldn't let her drown. He wouldn't. Liam, after that unsettling encounter in the hospital corridor, found his thoughts persistently returning to Ilara and her silent anguish. The image of her dissolved in tears, clutching those daunting hospital bills, had carved a deeper impression than he cared to admit. It was a stark contrast to the carefully curated reality of his own life, a world where such raw, unvarnished struggle was a distant, theoretical concept. His initial anonymous gesture of covering the smaller medical supply bills had been almost instinctual, a way to alleviate a fraction of her burden without direct confrontation. But as he began to delve deeper, prompted by an unfamiliar stirring of conscience, he started to unearth the convoluted layers of bureaucracy and exorbitant costs that plagued the American healthcare system. He leveraged his family's extensive network, not to flaunt wealth, but to gain access to information he wouldn't normally seek. He began a quiet investigation into Ilara's mother's case, sifting through hospital records, billing statements, and insurance claims with a meticulousness that surprised even himself. What he discovered was a labyrinth of systemic inefficiencies and questionable charges. There were duplicated bills for the same procedure, inflated prices for medications, and charges for services that seemed unnecessary or even redundant. The hospital, while a top-tier facility, operated with a profit-driven model that often prioritized revenue over patient affordability. He uncovered several instances where Ilara had been misinformed or deliberately steered away from financial assistance programs she would have qualified for. It wasn't malicious intent, not outright fraud, but rather a pervasive culture of maximizing income and minimizing efforts to help those struggling. He saw how the system, designed to be complex, had systematically worn down Ilara's spirit and drained her meager resources, leaving her vulnerable to the very high-interest loans she was now contemplating. The realization filled Liam with a quiet indignation. It wasn't just about Ilara. It was about the fundamental unfairness embedded within the system, a system he had always implicitly trusted, a system his family's philanthropy often supported without truly understanding its underbelly. Equipped with this newfound, uncomfortable knowledge, Liam knew his anonymous, indirect assistance wouldn't be enough. He needed to engage, however reluctantly. He approached Ilara in the hospital cafeteria, where she was distractedly picking at a sandwich, looking utterly exhausted. The air between them was charged with an unspoken tension, a mix of his calculated reserve and her palpable weariness. He maintained a careful distance, both physically and emotionally. "Ilara," he began, his voice even, almost sterile. "I've heard about your situation from some of the administration staff." It was a partial truth, an acceptable white lie to initiate contact without revealing the extent of his clandestine investigation. He watched her carefully, noting the flicker of surprise, then suspicion in her eyes. "Heard what, exactly?" she asked, her voice tinged with defensiveness, a protective shield against further intrusion or judgment. Liam offered a slight, almost imperceptible shrug. "Just that your mother's bills are becoming overwhelming, and that you're having trouble navigating the financial department." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I have some familiarity with how these systems work. My family has been involved with this hospital for generations. Sometimes knowing the right questions to ask or the right departments to approach can make a difference." He omitted the part about him having actively unearthed the hospital's questionable practices. He simply offered guidance, a lifeline without a visible rope. He suggested specific forms, pointed her towards obscured clauses in the hospital's patient rights documents, and mentioned the existence of lesser-known charitable funds that were often overlooked by overwhelmed patients. He even subtly hinted at certain avenues for reducing specific charges, without directly admitting he knew them to be inflated. He spoke with an air of detached efficiency, like a consultant offering pro bono advice, carefully avoiding any emotional connection that might make Ilara feel indebted or compromised. Ilara, though still wary of Liam's sudden and seemingly uncharacteristic interest, listened intently. His advice, though delivered with a formality that bordered on coldness, resonated with a sliver of hope. She had battled the hospital's financial department for weeks, feeling like she was speaking to a brick wall. To have someone, especially someone from Liam's privileged world, acknowledge the complexity and offer concrete, actionable steps felt like a small miracle. She thanked him, her gratitude cautious, still unsure of his true motives. "I appreciate it," she said, her voice soft but sincere. "I've felt like I was just banging my head against a wall." Following Liam's guidance, Ilara spent the next few days meticulously reviewing her mother's bills again. Armed with the new knowledge he had imparted, she approached the billing department with a renewed sense of purpose, citing specific codes and policies Liam had mentioned. To her astonishment, her persistence, now backed by more informed arguments, began to yield results. A charge for an unnecessary diagnostic test was removed. A medication cost was adjusted to reflect a generic alternative. A reprocessing fee was waived. Each small victory, though chipping away at merely a fraction of the monumental debt, felt like a monumental achievement. The original devastating sum remained largely intact, but the relentless pressure eased slightly. There was still a mountain to climb, but now she had a slightly better, albeit still rugged, path. She felt a flicker of hope, a nascent belief that perhaps, just perhaps, she wasn't entirely alone in this fight. She didn't connect these small triumphs directly to Liam's deeper hidden intervention, but rather to her own renewed strength and his timely, if impersonal, advice. This small victory, however modest, fueled her, providing a much-needed boost to her faltering resolve, unaware of the true depth of Liam's involvement and the more significant actions he was quietly orchestrating behind the scenes. This was just the beginning of his carefully calculated plan. Liam, after days of internal deliberation and careful strategizing, finally put his comprehensive plan into motion. His initial goal was to alleviate Ilara's immediate, crushing financial burden without directly revealing his involvement, a nuanced approach designed to preserve her dignity while offering substantial relief. He understood that a direct payment would likely be refused, or, at the very least, cause her considerable discomfort, possibly leading to questions he wasn't yet ready to answer. His strategy was sophisticated, leveraging the intricate web of connections his family had meticulously built over generations. He didn't just write a check, he orchestrated a subtle yet powerful intervention. He began by discreetly contacting the Sterling Family Foundation, a vast philanthropic entity established by his grandfather, renowned for its anonymous contributions to various medical research and patient support initiatives. Within the foundation's complex structure, he identified a specific fund dedicated to assisting patients with catastrophic medical debts, particularly those who were uninsured or underinsured, and whose cases presented an unusual degree of hardship. Ilara's mother's situation fit the criteria perfectly, especially given the hospital's increasingly aggressive billing practices that Liam had uncovered. He presented the case to the Foundation's Oversight Committee, carefully omitting his personal connection, framing it as an anonymous referral from a concerned party within the healthcare system who had observed the egregious financial strain on a particular family. He highlighted the unjustifiable charges he had previously identified and the bureaucratic indifference Ilara had faced, emphasizing the moral imperative for intervention. His influence, though carefully veiled, was undeniable. The Foundation, accustomed to Liam's meticulous research and rare yet impactful recommendations, quickly approved a substantial grant. This grant was specifically earmarked to cover the majority of Ilara's mother's outstanding medical bills, designated to be channeled through a subsidiary charitable initiative associated directly with the hospital. This ensured the funds would bypass Ilara entirely and go directly to settle the institution's claims, presented under the guise of an institutional benevolent gesture rather than individual charity. Liam meticulously oversaw every detail, ensuring the paperwork was impeccable and the transfer was made with utmost discretion, leaving no traceable link back to him. He even orchestrated a subtle internal communication within the hospital's financial department, suggesting they expedite the processing of this charitable initiative to alleviate a particularly distressing case. He wanted it to appear as if the system, after much pressure, had finally worked in Ilara's favor, rather than a direct act of personal intervention. Days later, Ilara received the call that would irrevocably alter her trajectory. It came late in the afternoon, while she was hunched over her laptop, desperately scrolling through listings for second jobs and affordable loan options, her mind a dizzying mix of anxiety and exhaustion. The voice on the other end was professional, polite, and, to Ilara's stunned ears, utterly surreal. It was Ms. Davies from the hospital's financial department, the very woman who had previously delivered stern warnings about impending deadlines and collection agencies. "Ms. Torres," Ms. Davies began, her tone noticeably softer than their previous exchanges. "I have some rather significant news regarding your mother's outstanding balance." Ilara's heart pounded, bracing herself for another ultimatum, another demand she couldn't meet. She clutched her phone tighter. "We've just received notification," Ms. Davies continued, a hint of something akin to surprise in her voice, "that a substantial portion of your mother's bill, specifically 75% of the remaining balance, has been covered." Ilara's breath hitched. "Covered? By whom?" she managed to stammer, her voice barely a whisper. "It's from an anonymous donor, Ms. Torres," the financial officer explained. "A philanthropic fund associated with our hospital, part of a new charitable initiative to assist patients facing extreme financial hardship. It's a significant amount, and it's been fully processed. You now only owe the remaining 25%, which we can easily set up a manageable payment plan for." The words swirled in Ilara's head, each one a feather-light touch lifting an unbearable weight. 75%. Anonymous donor. Charitable initiative. It felt like a dream, a cruel trick of her exhausted mind. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring her vision. She gripped the phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. It was real. The crushing, suffocating burden that had threatened to drown her had suddenly, miraculously, evaporated. The immediate instinct was disbelief, then overwhelming relief that threatened to buckle her knees. She sank onto her worn sofa, tears streaming down her face, not of sorrow, but of profound, unadulterated gratitude. She tried to form words of thanks, to ask for more details, but her voice was choked with emotion. Thank you," she choked out. I don't know what to say." Ms. Davies, perhaps sensing the depth of Ilara's relief, offered a kindly, "You're very welcome, Ms. Torres. It's truly wonderful news. We'll send you an updated statement shortly, and someone will be in touch to discuss the remaining balance and payment options. Please, try not to worry." After the call ended, Ilara sat there for a long time, the phone still pressed to her ear, the warmth of the receiver a stark contrast to the cold dread that had plagued her for weeks. The silence of her small apartment felt different now, lighter, imbued with a newfound hope. She barely believed the news, pinching herself, convinced she would wake up from this incredible fantasy. Yet the weight in her chest was gone, replaced by an exhilarating lightness she hadn't felt in months. Her mother. Her mother would be okay. The medical bills, the relentless demands, the desperate searches for solutions, they were no longer an insurmountable mountain. Unbeknownst to Ilara, Liam was experiencing his own quiet moment of reflection. He had arranged to be in a specific, secluded waiting area of the hospital during the time he knew the call would be made. From his vantage point, partially obscured by a potted palm, he could just see the entrance to Ilara's mother's ward. He didn't see Ilara herself, but not long after the scheduled time for the call, he observed a nurse hurrying out of the ward, a wide, relieved smile on her face, exchanging a quick, congratulatory word with a colleague about that poor woman's daughter finally getting a break. Then, a short while later, he saw Ilara emerge. Her face was tear-streaked, but the profound despair that had etched itself onto her features weeks ago was gone. In its place was an expression of pure, unburdened relief, a radiant wave of gratitude washing over her. She paused for a moment, her gaze unfocused, as if trying to process the magnitude of what had just transpired. Then, she brought a hand to her mouth, stifling a sob, and quickly hurried down the corridor, presumably to share the incredible news with her mother. Liam watched her disappear, a subtle, almost imperceptible smile crossing his face. It was a rare display of emotion for him, a quiet acknowledgement of the impact his actions had made. The act wasn't for recognition or even for gratitude, but for the profound shift he witnessed in another human being's spirit. Seeing her relief, knowing he was the catalyst, brought an unexpected sense of satisfaction, a warmth that resonated deeper than any financial success or societal accolades ever had. The heavy burden had lifted, and with it, a glimmer of something new had sparked within Liam himself. Ilara's mother, Maria, began her recovery with a vigor that surprised even her doctors. The weight of the medical debt had been a silent, insidious burden on both women, a shadow stretching over every hopeful prognosis. Now, with the anonymous intervention, that shadow had receded significantly, replaced by a radiant wave of relief. Maria's appetite improved. Her physical therapy sessions yielded faster results, and the weary, worried lines around her eyes began to soften. Ilara dedicated herself entirely to her mother's rehabilitation, spending hours reading to her, helping her with exercises, and simply being present, knowing that this precious time was no longer overshadowed by imminent financial ruin. The nurses and doctors remarked on Maria's renewed spirit, attributing it to her daughter's unwavering devotion, unaware of the invisible hand that had truly lifted the heaviest strain. Ilara, in turn, was filled with a deep, almost overwhelming sense of gratitude. She knew that someone, somewhere, had performed an act of immense generosity, a kindness that had literally saved her mother's life and their future. The desire to personally thank this mysterious benefactor became an insistent whisper in Ilara's mind. She imagined the relief she had felt, multiplied by hundreds of thousands of dollars, and knew that words alone wouldn't suffice for such a profound gesture. She began asking discreetly at the hospital's financial department, then with the social workers, and even some of the more senior nurses she had grown close to. Each inquiry, however, led to a dead end. The hospital staff, bound by confidentiality and perhaps genuinely ignorant of the benefactor's true identity, maintained a polite but firm silence. "It was an anonymous donation, Ms. Torres," Ms. Davies had reiterated kindly but firmly on one occasion. "We are simply the facilitators. Your gratitude is best shown by focusing on your mother's recovery." Ilara understood, of course, but the unanswered question gnawed at her. She felt an almost spiritual obligation to look this person in the eye, to convey the depth of her family's appreciation. It was more than just money. It was hope, a chance at life, a resurrection of their future. She pictured various scenarios, trying to imagine who possessed such wealth and such compassion, perhaps a former patient, a benevolent foundation. Her mind cycled through possibilities, none of which seemed to fit the quiet, impactful nature of the donation. It wasn't a grand, publicized charity event. It was a focused, precise act that arrived exactly when it was needed most. One afternoon, a few weeks after Maria had been discharged and was continuing her recovery at home, Ilara returned to the hospital to pick up some updated prescription forms and schedule a follow-up appointment. Though Maria was now home, the hospital still held a significant place in Ilara's daily routine. As she navigated the familiar corridors, her mind still partially consumed by the lingering mystery of her benefactor, she turned a corner near the main atrium and suddenly found herself face to face with Liam Sterling. He was standing by a large window, gazing out at the bustling city below, his impeccably tailored suit a stark contrast to the utilitarian hospital environment. His profile was sharp, almost hawkish, but as he turned at her approach, she caught a glimpse of something less guarded in his eyes than she remembered. A flicker of recognition, perhaps even a brief moment of surprise. Ilara paused, a knot forming in her stomach. Their previous interactions had been brief, formal, and always tinged with the awkwardness of their vastly different worlds. Yet, he was the only person who had offered her any kind of concrete advice during her darkest hours, subtly guiding her through the bureaucratic maze. "Mr. Sterling," Ilara said, her voice a little softer than she intended, a residual tremor of nervousness still present from weeks of high stress. Liam turned fully, his expression shifting from distant contemplation to a more direct, though still reserved, acknowledgement. "Ms. Torres," he responded, his tone even, professional. "How is your mother doing?" It was a question he hadn't asked before, a departure from their previous detached exchanges. A surge of warmth spread through Ilara. "She's much better, thank you," she replied, a genuine smile gracing her lips. "She's home now, and recovering wonderfully. The doctors are amazed by her progress." Liam nodded slowly, a slight tilt of his head indicating he was listening intently. "That's good to hear." Gathering her courage, Ilara continued, "I also wanted to thank you again, Mr. Sterling, for your advice those few weeks ago. It really helped. It pointed me in the right direction." She hesitated, then pressed on. "Things took a turn for the better in a way I never thought possible. A large part of her bill was covered by an anonymous donor." She watched his face carefully, searching for any flicker of recognition, any hint that he might know something. Liam's expression remained unreadable for a moment, then a very faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of his lips. It wasn't the detached smirk she'd seen before, nor the cold impassiveness. This was different, smaller, more genuine. "Sometimes," he said, his voice low, "things have a way of working out when people truly need them to. I'm glad my suggestions offered some clarity." He paused, then added, "My grandmother is also doing well, by the way. She's making remarkable progress." Ilara felt a strange sense of connection in that brief exchange. He wasn't just the billionaire's son anymore. He was a person who had, in a small way, offered a lifeline, and who now shared the experience of having a loved one recover within these very walls. "That's wonderful news," she said, her smile widening. "I hope they both continue to get stronger every day." Liam met her gaze, and for the first time, Ilara felt a subtle current of understanding pass between them. There was no grand revelation, no sudden confession, but in the subdued warmth of his gaze and the quiet sincerity of his words, Ilara sensed something deeper than mere politeness. The question of her anonymous benefactor remained unanswered, but in that small, unexpected encounter with Liam Sterling, a new, tentative bridge had been built where only a chasm had existed before. Perhaps, she thought, some mysteries were meant to remain. Their impact felt more profoundly than their source needed to be known. Yet, the subtle shift in Liam's demeanor, that genuine, albeit small, smile, resonated within her, stirring a quiet curiosity she hadn't anticipated. It was a moment that transcended their previous roles, hinting at a shared humanity that even vast wealth could not entirely obscure. The overwhelming wave of relief that flooded Ilara after the call was a turning point, a definitive shift from the suffocating anxiety that had dominated her life for months. The hospital's financial department had indeed followed through, and an updated statement arrived, showing a dramatically reduced balance. The anonymous donor had covered a substantial portion, leaving Ilara with a manageable sum she could realistically pay off over time. This meant her mother, Maria, would continue to receive the best possible care without the specter of debt looming over them. Maria's recovery, which had been steady but slow, seemed to accelerate with this newfound peace of mind. The stress on Ilara's face, which Maria had instinctively picked up on, had dissipated, replaced by a radiant hope that was infectious. Ilara dedicated herself wholeheartedly to her mother's rehabilitation. She spent countless hours reading to her, helping with gentle exercises prescribed by the physical therapist, and simply holding her hand, sharing quiet moments of gratitude. The fear of losing her mother due to financial constraints had been a heavy chain around her heart, and its removal allowed her to breathe freely, to truly believe in a future where they could both thrive. She found herself smiling more, laughing more easily, and the weight on her shoulders felt miraculously lifted. Her faith in humanity, which had been tested so severely by bureaucratic indifference and the harsh realities of medical debt, was profoundly restored. Someone, a complete stranger, had chosen kindness, and that act resonated deep within her soul. Despite the joy, Ilara couldn't shake the persistent curiosity about her benefactor. Who was this person who had intervened so decisively, so anonymously? She made discreet inquiries at the hospital, hoping to glean some small detail, a name, anything that might help her express her boundless thanks. However, every path led to a dead end. The hospital staff, bound by privacy regulations and perhaps also by Liam's careful instructions, remained tight-lipped. "A charitable initiative, Ms. Torres," was the standard refrain. "We're unable to disclose donor information." Though frustrated by the lack of direct contact, Ilara understood the need for anonymity and respected it, vowing to honor the kindness shown to her by paying it forward in her own way, whenever she could. It was during one of her regular visits to the hospital, just a few weeks after Maria had been moved to a rehabilitation wing, that Ilara encountered Liam again. This time their interaction felt different. He was still visiting his grandmother, who was making a slow but steady recovery, and they crossed paths in a quiet corner of the hospital garden. The air was softer, the light gentler, and the weight of their earlier, more strained encounters seemed to have dissipated with the lifting of Ilara's burden. Ilara saw him first, and a flicker of recognition, a mix of appreciation for his earlier, albeit detached advice, and a lingering sense of his distant demeanor, crossed her face. "Mr. Sterling," she began, her voice softer than usual, "I wanted to thank you again for your advice about navigating the hospital system. It truly helped." Liam looked at her, and for the first time Alara noticed a genuine, albeit small and fleeting, smile touch his lips. It wasn't the cynical smirk she'd seen months ago, nor the impassive mask he often wore. This was softer, almost vulnerable. "I'm glad it was useful," he replied, his voice still low but lacking the usual edge of aloofness. He paused, his gaze lingering on her for a moment. "It seems things have improved for your mother." It wasn't a question, but an observation, tinged with an unspoken understanding. Ilara's eyes softened, a rush of emotion making her voice tremble slightly. "More than improved, Mr. Sterling. It's a miracle. We received help from an anonymous donor, and it's made all the difference. My mother is recovering so well now, and the financial stress is finally gone. I only wish I could thank them." She looked at him expectantly, a faint hope that he might hold a clue. But Liam simply nodded, his expression returning to its typical composure, revealing nothing. He offered a slight inclination of his head, a gesture of polite dismissal, and walked away, leaving Alara to wonder, as he always did. His act of quiet generosity had profoundly transformed not only Alara's life but also his own perspective. For Liam, it was a subtle awakening. He had spent his life accustomed to a world where problems were solved with money and connections, rarely truly confronting raw human vulnerability and the systemic injustices that often created it. Witnessing Alara's initial despair and then her subsequent unburdened relief had given him a deeper understanding of empathy and the powerful impact of actions beyond mere financial transactions. He learned that true value lay not in what he possessed, but in the power he had to alleviate suffering, even if it meant remaining an unseen hand. The satisfaction he felt was internal, a quiet resonance that no public accolade could ever match. He continued his own journey of quiet growth, his world subtly expanded by the maid's daughter who had inadvertently shown him a different kind of wealth. Ilara and her mother embarked on a new chapter, one filled with hope and resilience. Maria's recovery progressed beautifully, and soon she was back home, slowly regaining her strength, the shadow of debt no longer darkening their doorway. Ilara, free from the crushing financial burden, was able to pursue her own aspirations, knowing that the kindness of a stranger had given them a second chance. Their story became a testament to the unexpected compassion that can emerge from the unlikeliest of places, a reminder that even in a world often dominated by privilege and disparity, a single act of silent generosity can illuminate the path to a brighter future. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like and share it with someone who needs a dose of hope and a reminder of human kindness. What do you think about Liam's silent act of compassion and its profound impact on both Ilara and himself? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel and click the bell for notifications, so you do not miss our next inspiring story that explores the surprising connections that shape our lives. We bring you tales of resilience, unexpected turns, and the enduring power of empathy every single week.